Here's a book that every Steelers fan should add to their library. It's called A Different Way to Win, Dan Rooney's story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule. I sat down with author Jim Rooney to talk about his personal and professional view of his father's long career both in football and his service to the nation. Here's part of that conversation. Jim, your father was no doubt one of the chief architects of the NFL in terms of maybe doing the right thing, which seems to be a theme that we're speaking about today. You cite several examples in your book. Can you mention some of them of things that maybe he helped push others towards to really benefit the NFL?
Right. So my father did several things in the league. I think that he was very much a mentor and a partner to all three of the major commissioners of his life. He did some significant things to what have resulted in revenue. And then I think the largest thing that he did was his work with labor. And so he was basically the NFL's chief negotiator between management and labor for about 50 years. So he was at the first meeting between what would become the NFL Players Association and the league in 1957 when he was 24 years old. And he was in charge of negotiation from 1968 to about 1993. You had several work stoppages, and there was, the relationship was pretty acrimonious. And my father had this style that, again, he was always trying to look for a win-win. He understood that the players were more than just, some sort of bargaining relationship. And so this affinity for them and his willingness to see labor in, I think, a different perspective than a lot of the other owners was really important to getting deals done. And he built this sense of trust with them. Gene Upshaw was the head of the NFLPA through many of those years, and his number two was a guy named Doug Allen. And Doug was a Penn State football player and played for the Buffalo Bills. And Doug told me this great story about, he said, when other folks, from management would come in the room, they would treat us like we smelled. And your father always treated us with respect. He would come in, he would talk about our families, he would have lunch with us. He offered to fly Doug home to Penn State one day. He said he never didn't negotiate for management's point of view, but he always had this willingness to treat us in a way that we knew we could trust him. We knew if he said something that it was going to be true. If he couldn't answer a question, he would tell us up front that that's where we were. So that the players talked about bargaining with Dan Rooney was something that they could rely upon, and that was important to coming to these labor deals. And then ultimately in 1993, you got to free agency, and it became basically the framework for the 30 years that we've had of labor peace, which has been essential to the television contracts, the stadium development, all the things that have happened in terms of the massive growth of the NFL. I think you had to have this long and stable sense of labor peace, and my father was certainly one of the key architects in making that happen.
There's several maybe characteristics or ways that you sum up your dad and maybe why he was so good at winning in various ways of his life that I want to go through. You said that he was not a micromanager, but certainly cared about the details. Can you explain?
Sure, and I think that becomes a confusing response, because we thought a lot about that, and Joe Gordon and several of the other folks that we talked to that he was their manager said no, he didn't micromanage us, but he was always involved. So the best example I was given was by your cohort Bob Labriola, and he talked about him as a orchestra conductor, that my father understood the entire orchestra. He didn't go and tell one instrument that they have to play this note or that note, but his ear was always paying attention, and if you weren't playing the right note, he would sit down with you and work with you and make sure that you got on board, that everyone, ultimately you were going to create this great piece of music, and that everyone had to be in concert, if you will, to do that. So he constantly had his ear to the ground to what everyone was playing, but he didn't get on your back. He was always there as sort of a resource to work with folks, to help them understand what the vision was, understand what opportunities or what processes, et cetera, they might need. He was famous for if sort of you needed that intervention at a high level to get something done, whether it was with a league office or in Ireland, they talk about calling the White House, that my father would get it done right away, and that everyone who worked for him just appreciated that he was always collaborative. He was always trying to move things forward. He could be very tough, but it was in a way that was challenging you intellectually. It was trying to further the situation, not that it was somehow penalizing. But there were these hard challenges that he would offer, but that folks who were talented actually really responded to that well, and it became something important to them.
Another word you used a lot was authentic, which seems to be something that he learned from your grandfather, Art Rooney Sr.
Right. So I think that both my father and my grandfather were pretty authentic, and they had different personalities, but I believe they were both pretty true to who they were. And the easiest way for I think a lot of people to understand it is they were never performing. They didn't do things for effect or for a response. They did them because they thought it was the right thing to do. They thought it was the best decision. So on my grandfather's case, in so many ways, it was relational. It was about, how do I connect with someone, and how do we, build something that is meaningful? How do we work something out? With my father, especially early on in his career, it was more strategic. It was, what are we trying to get done here? What is the purpose or the intent of what we're doing, and how do we build a strategy that has to do that? So there was sort of this no nonsense approach to him from that perspective.